I thought Missy her sissy fell down some apples and pears before she could ever be the baked bean.
Alright, that just sucks, right?
Westeros, a name that used to mean peak television, but now mostly gives me Season 8 flashbacks. After the dumpster fire that was the final season of Game of Thrones, our trust in this brand is essentially a pile of ash. I've become cynical, haven't I? Every time HBO announces a new spin-off, I don't really feel excitement, I feel a slight shudder of cringe. Because I expect corporate slop, safe, sterile franchise filler intended to milk every last cent out of George R.R. Martin's legacy. And those were my thoughts when I first heard about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. But surprisingly, there's no epic map rising out of the ground, no Ramin Djawadi orchestral masterpiece to tell you that something big is happening. Instead, this show starts with mud, rain, and the lead character having graphic diarrhea. Considering the franchise's recent context, it's a masterclass in subverting expectations. While other shows give us 60-minute trailers for a future season, this show starts with a knight literally shitting his guts out into the dirt. It's a metaphoric statement. I am sorry, but that needed to be said. They are defecating on the epic fantasy trope to give us something grounded, gritty, and human. No dragons, no White Walkers, just a tall guy and a bold kid trying to survive. You might be surprised by what this show reminds me of, because it's not even Game of Thrones, and I'll get to that later. So how did this low-stakes, nobody story manage to restore my faith in a franchise that I thought was pretty much past its expiry date? Well, in this video, we're going to find out. Let's get to the bottom of why this show worked where the rest of Westeros failed.
Where are my dragons?
Look, we've been conditioned by modern Hollywood to think that more always equals better. If a movie is successful, the sequel needs twice the budget, 3 times the explosions, and a multiverse where 5 versions of the same character point at each other like that one Spider-Man meme. It's the age of escalation. In Westeros, this usually means more dragons, more incest, and stakes so high that if the protagonist fails, the literal sun stops shining. We saw it in the final season of Game of Thrones, where the show pivoted from a tight political drama into a bloated fantasy action mess, trying to outdo its own spectacle until it eventually tripped over its own CGI cape. But A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms goes small. I'm talking micro scale. I'm talking one tournament and a muddy field small. And it's the most refreshing thing to happen to this franchise since the Red Wedding, minus the soul-crushing trauma. You might call this Red Dead Redemption in Westeros, or the lo-fi playlist of Game of Thrones, if you know what I mean. There's a coziness here that shouldn't exist in a world where people get their head crushed for sport. Instead of a narrative that teleports you between 5 different continents and introduces 30 different lords named Aegon or Aemond. Seriously, George, get a baby name book, my guy. This story is remarkably self-contained and intimate. It's a slice of life in a world that usually only shows us the slice of a throat. We aren't jumping to the wall to check on a zombie infestation. We aren't sailing to Essos to watch a queen wander through the desert for 3 seasons. We stay put. And by staying put, the world starts to feel like a real environment again, rather than just a theatrical stage for important people to give important speeches. That has its place, but that place is not here. Let's take our main man, Ser Duncan the Tall. Dunk isn't a chosen one. He isn't the prince that was promised. Not that that even matters. And he certainly doesn't have a claim to the Iron Throne. Dunk is essentially a blue-collar worker. He's a guy with a job, and that job is being a hedge knight, which in the hierarchy of Westeros is about 1 step above a professional grave robber. His ambitions aren't global. He's just trying to find a job that's slightly less harsh than his last one. He needs to eat and fix his armor. Dunk is the everyman of Westeros. He represents the working guy in a universe that usually treats commoners like background NPCs meant to be burned by dragonfire for a cool wide shot. And because Dunk is a commoner, our perspective of Westeros shifts entirely. In House of the Dragon, the small folk are just a faceless mass of people cheering or screaming in the dragon pit. Here, they are the story. We spend time with blacksmiths, puppeteers, serving girls, and merchants. The world functions as a living environment where buying a dozen goose eggs is a major plot point. There's a scene where Dunk is just trying to get a decent sandwich, and I found myself more invested in that than I was in the entire blood and cheese sequence from House of the Dragon. Why? Because I've been hungry. I've needed to pay rent. I've never had to decide which of my 3 dragons I should fly into a civil war. This show leans into these mundane textures. It's dirty, it's wet, and it's gloriously unglamorous. Remember that opening that I mentioned? The diarrhea scene? It's not just a joke for the sake of a joke, though it is funny in a look how the mighty have fallen kind of way. It tells you immediately, hey, this guy isn't Lancelot. He's a guy who's been sleeping in the rain and eating bad stew. But the real magic here, ironically, in a show with no magic, is the narrative independence. You don't have to do homework to watch A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. You don't need to have a family tree pulled up on your phone just to understand who is betraying whom. No dragons, unless you count the painted wooden ones in the puppet show, which were more compelling than some of the CGI lizards we've been seeing lately. This show completely ignores the heavy mythology that has started to choke the life out of the franchise. There's no talk of the Long Night or the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, which we all know just ends up being a big pile of shit because of Season 8 of Game of Thrones. And thank God for that. House of the Dragon Season 2 spent so much time reminding us about the prophecy that it felt less like a story and more like a 10-hour prequel to a season of Game of Thrones that we all hated. It was like watching a movie that keeps nudging you in the ribs and saying, hey, remember the Night King? Remember how he died in 10 minutes after 8 years of build-up? Wasn't that great? No, HBO, it wasn't. Stop talking about it. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms feels like it's actually allowed to be its own thing, because Dunk is a simpleton, and I say that with love. He doesn't care about prophecies. He doesn't know about the secret history of the Targaryens. He's just a tall guy standing in a field. This makes him the perfect vessel for the audience. We see the world through his eyes, and his eyes are fixed on the mud in front of him, not the stars above him. This lack of bloat is why the show feels so effective. House of the Dragon Season 2 specifically, for all its technical brilliance, suffered from a serious pacing problem. It felt stretched out, like butter scraped over too much bread. Shout out to Bilbo. It was a season of moving chess pieces where nothing actually really happens until the very end. And even then, the finale was just a trailer for Season 3. It was a 60-minute parking lot experience. But Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, because the story is so small, every minute counts. Every conversation between Dunk and Egg feels earned. Every interaction with a local lord feels tense, because for a hedge knight, a bad word to the wrong person isn't just a political faux pas, it's a death sentence. The stakes are personal, not global. If Dunk loses, the world doesn't end, but his world ends. And in a way, that's much more gripping. It's about honor, kindness, and hope in a world where life is cheap. It's a heart-on-the-sleeve story that isn't afraid to be sincere. After years of the franchise being defined by militant nihilism and grim, dark misery, this feels like a genuine breath of fresh air. It reminds me of why I liked this world in the first place. In fact, loved this world. Not because of the dragons, but because of the people living in their shadows. It's funny, isn't it? HBO spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to recreate the epic scale of Game of Thrones, but the best thing they've produced in years is a show about a tall guy and a bald kid who's probably smarter than everyone else in the kingdom. It turns out simplicity isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of confidence. It's a sign that the writers actually trust their characters to carry the show without needing a CGI dragon to bail them out every 10 minutes. This chamber, local approach is exactly what the Doctor ordered. It's slow, it's focused, and it's deeply human. And in an era where every major franchise is trying to be the biggest thing ever, being a small story in a big world is the most heroic thing this show could do. Logic. It's a funny thing in a fantasy show, isn't it? For years, Game of Thrones was the gold standard for internal consistency. You knew that if a character made a mistake, they paid for it. If they traveled from Winterfell to King's Landing, it took months, and we felt every mile of that journey through the mud and the conversations along the way. But then something broke. Somewhere around Season 7, the writers apparently found a stash of cheat codes and decided that logic was just a suggestion. We all remember the infamous fast travel era of Game of Thrones. news. Characters started teleporting across Westeros like they'd unlocked the fast travel points in an open world RPG. 1 minute Daenerys is on Dragonstone, the next she's beyond the wall in what feels like 5 minutes of screen time. Gendry, the man of 1,000 marathons, ran 7 marathons back to the wall in 2 minutes just so the plot could move forward. It was stupid and lazy. It was the kind of writing that treated the audience like they had the attention span of a fork. And don't even get me started on the spectacle over logic phase. The Dothraki charge into the darkness during the long night, a masterclass in tactical suicide. The Scorpions in Season 8 that could 3-tap a dragon from a moving boat 1 week but couldn't hit a barn door the next because the plot needed Daenerys to win. It was just insulting. It was junk food cinema at its worst. It looks flashy in the moment, but it leaves you feeling empty and a little bit sick once the credits roll. This is why A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms feels like such a revelation, because it doesn't just return to the internal logic of the early seasons of Game of Thrones, but it doubles down on it. It brings back the physical weight of the world, and that weight feels glorious. Let's talk about the physicality of Ser Duncan the Tall. Dunk is a big guy, hence the name, but the show doesn't just tell you he's tall, it shows you the consequences of it. Dunk is constantly hitting his head on low door frames. He's awkward in small rooms, he doesn't fit into the world of the civilized lords. It's a tiny detail of a big guy, but it's world building 101. It anchors him in a physical reality. And yes, we have to talk about the diarrhea again.
One word, and I hit you again.
I'm telling Mother.
I know, I'm obsessed with it. I love shit, okay? But this is a major tonal marker. In high fantasy, knights are these glowing paragons of virtue who never seem to need a bathroom. In Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Dunk is suffering from dysentery because he's a hedge knight who eats questionable stew and sleeps in the dirt. It's a reminder that in this world, more people died from bad water and infection than from Valyrian steel. It deconstructs the romantic image of knighthood and replaces it with the dangerous profession it actually was. It's a world where being a hero often means just surviving another day without getting a fever. And the groundedness extends to the action. It's not plot armor fueled spectacle where heroes survive being engulfed by a wave of the dead. It's messy, clumsy, and desperate. When people fight in the show, you feel the dirt and blood. You feel the claustrophobia of the helmet and the difficulty of swinging a massive piece of sharpened iron while standing in knee-deep mud. The Ashford Tournament is depicted not as a glorious festival, but as a meat grinder. It's a place where unskilled knights go to die. There's a scene where Prince Aeron Targaryen, a man who is basically a walking advertisement for why the Targaryens shouldn't be allowed to interbreed, cruelly kills a horse during a tilt. It's not aesthetic violence, it's ugly, sad, and shocking. It underscores the reality of the situation. These are dangerous games played by dangerous men. There's no high fantasy polish here to protect your feelings. But the real MVP of this chapter is the pacing. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is slow, and I say that as a massive compliment. In a time where everyone is terrified that the audience will get bored if there isn't an explosion every 10 minutes, this show is brave enough to let a scene breathe. It savors the slowness. It follows a day in the life formula where we see the sun rise and the sun set. We see the time it takes to travel between a camp and a castle. If Dunk needs to get somewhere, he walks, or he rides a horse that's probably as tired as he is. This slice of life pacing allows us to focus on the textures of the world. We spend time watching Dunk buy goose eggs. We watch him and Egg sit on a grassy hill and just talk. We see them prepare a sandwich. To some, this might be boring, but to me, it's essential. These moments create a sense of real-time adventure. They build the immersion that was so violently stripped away during the later seasons of Game of Thrones. It's a return to the political and personal game where character moments are allowed to stew in the audience's mind. The showrunners aren't trying to stimulate your brain every 5 seconds with a cameo or a dragon. They trust the story. They trust that watching a man wrestle with his honor while trying to cook a decent meal is actually more interesting than a $200 million CGI battle where nobody of importance ever dies. And let's talk about cause and effect. In the early days of Game of Thrones, every action had a reaction. Ned Stark goes to King's Landing. He dies because of his honor. Robb Stark breaks a marriage pact. He gets red weddinged. But in the later years, characters started to make mind-numbingly stupid decisions and survived because the plot needed them to. Think about the White Hunt in Season 7, a plan so logically bankrupt it makes a flat Earth convention look like a NASA briefing. And yet, almost everyone survived because they had the thickest plot armor in history, except for Thoros of Myr. Rest in peace. In A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, logic is back in the driver's seat because the scope is limited to Ashford. The show maintains perfect logical continuity. We know where everyone is. We know why they are there. There are no contrived scenarios like the one in the House of the Dragon Season 2 finale, where Alicent and Rhaenyra have a secret meeting that makes absolutely zero sense for either character's safety or motivations. That was a scene written because the producers wanted a big moment between their two leads, not because it made sense for the story. It was a 60-minute trailer for a season that didn't exist yet. In Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, every important moment is earned. There is no filler. Even a scene of Dunk hitting his head is working to establish his physical presence and the limitations of his environment. Every minute is used to move the needle on his relationship with Egg or his understanding of the world. It's a tight script that doesn't need to shout to get your attention. This attention to detail is what restores the immersion. You start to believe in this world again. You stop looking for the wires. You stop wondering how a character got from point A to point B. You just exist with them in the mud of Ashford. It's funny, isn't it? We spent years asking for bigger and better. We wanted the Battle of the Bastards, we wanted the dragons, we wanted the wow factor, and we got it, but in the process we lost the soul of the show. Game of Thrones was always at its best when it was a political drama, not an action fantasy show. We lost the feeling that this was a real place with real consequences. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a reminder that you just need a character who hits his head on a doorframe and a writer who knows that a long walk is better than a short teleport. Let's talk about the prophecy problem from the other side. We've reached a point in modern fantasy where characters are no longer allowed to be just people. They have to be vessels of destiny. They have to be the chosen one, the prince that was promised, or the person who fulfills a 300-year-old dream because a CGI stag looked at them funny in the woods. Look at Jon Snow in the later seasons of Game of Thrones. By the end, he wasn't even a character anymore, just a sentient plot device whose only job was to say, "She's my queen," and look confused while the writers tried to figure out how to satisfy a prophecy that they'd forgotten about 4 years prior. When a character is driven by fate or prophecy, they lose their agency. They stop making choices because they have to be at point B for the world to be saved. It's passive and boring, and quite frankly, it's a lazy way to write a story. You don't need to worry about why a character does something if destiny is the one holding the steering wheel. But A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it looks at your prophecies, your songs of ice and fire, and your secret Targaryen bloodlines, and it says, "Cool. Anyway, I'm hungry and my feet hurt." So Duncan the Tall is the antidote to the epic hero fatigue. Dunk is just a guy. He's a working class knight. He's an everyman who happens to be 7 feet tall and a little bit thick in the head. Dunk doesn't have a grand vision for Westeros. He isn't trying to fix the world. He's just trying to be a good man in a world that usually rewards you for being a piece of shit. His virtue isn't some divine light. It's a messy, awkward, and deeply human kind of goodness. He's virtuous because he's too honest to be anything else. He's the guy who stays late at work to help a colleague, not because he wants a promotion, but because he genuinely thinks it's the right thing to do. In the hierarchy of Westeros, Dunk is a nobody. No lands, no gold, and most importantly, no plot armor. When Dunk gets into a fight, you genuinely worry because he isn't some legendary swordsman like Jaime Lannister or Arthur Dayne. He's just a big guy who's pretty good with a shield and has a lot of pure grit. And that worldview doesn't come out of nowhere. Dunk didn't just wake up one day and decide to be decent. He was taught, and the man who taught him is gone before the story even really begins. Sir Arlen of Pennytree is introduced and taken away almost immediately, but his presence lingers over the entire show. Arlen wasn't a famous knight. He didn't have banners, lands, or even his own tent. Half the time, he barely had enough money to eat properly. But what he did have was belief. Belief in knighthood as an idea, not a status symbol. This is important because Arlen represents a version of chivalry that has nothing to do with destiny or bloodlines. He wasn't chosen by fate. He didn't matter to history, and yet he chose to live and die as a good man. That belief is the only inheritance Dunk ever receives. Not a prophecy, not a sword with a name, just an example. Arlen dies poor, sick, and largely forgotten by the world, but the values he passed on survive him, and that's the show quietly telling you something radical for a modern fantasy series. Legacy doesn't have to be epic to be meaningful. And then there's Egg. If Dunk is the muscle, Egg is the brain, but he's the brain of a wise beyond his years kid who still has the annoying younger brother energy. Their chemistry is the absolute gold of this show, not that tired, grumpy mentor and innocent child cliche we've seen 1,000 times, looking at you, The Last of Us. It's a partnership between two outcasts. Egg has this infectious, genuine childhood wonder about the idea of chivalry, despite coming from the very family that is currently busy ruining the Seven Kingdoms. What makes Dunk so fascinating as a protagonist is that he knows nothing about the heavy lore of the franchise. He's just a commoner. He hasn't read the history books. He doesn't know about the secret Targaryen prophecy that House of the Dragon keeps trying to make happen like it's fetch. To Dunk, the Targaryens aren't dragons or gods, they're just the powerful, dangerous family that might have him executed if he looks at them the wrong way. Because Dunk is unburdened by destiny, the story is driven entirely by his moral choices. Take the moment he hits Prince Aerion Targaryen to save Tansel, the puppeteer girl. In any other show, this would be a scripted hero moment, but here it's a terrifying moral choice. Dunk knows that hitting a prince is a death sentence. He has everything to lose, his horse, his armor, his life, and nothing to gain. He does it because his clumsy honesty won't let him do anything else. This is where honor becomes a superpower. It's not a magic spell, it's a man choosing to face a death sentence because he can't stand to see a girl's hand get broken. Now, let's talk about the dialogue. I've spoken about how the dialogue in the later seasons of Game of Thrones devolved into quips and cringe. Characters started speaking in trailer-friendly sound bites. It felt like everyone was constantly trying to write their own Wikipedia iconic quotes section. I know a killer when I see one. Yeah, thanks, Arya. I think we all noticed the Dragon Lady just incinerated a city. You know, very, very observant of you. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms goes back to the source, and I mean that literally. A massive chunk of the dialogue is taken directly from the pages of Martin's novellas, of which I have read. And man, you can feel the difference. There's a literary thickness to the way these characters speak. It's not bombastic or epic, it's understated and often mundane. They discuss the smell of their own clothes. They talk about a sandwich. These characters feel like they inhabit a real world because they care about real world things. People in the 14th century, or the Westeros equivalent, didn't spend 24 hours a day talking about the fate of the realm. The interactions between Dunk and Egg are filled with sarcasm. It's infectious. You like hanging out with them. You'd probably grab a pint with Dunk, though he'd probably accidentally knock over your table and then apologize for 20 minutes. This one-to-one scale interaction is what made the early seasons of Game of Thrones so special. Think back to the scene with Robert Baratheon and Cersei talking about their marriage in season 1, one of the best scenes in the show. No dragons, no battles, just two people in a room being honest. That was the gold of the show. Game of Thrones was always at its best when it was two people in a room talking about power. It's just the gold of Game of Thrones. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is entirely composed of those gold moments. It's a show that trusts its actors to convey complex emotions through a look or a pause in conversation. The chemistry is built into the way they bicker over who has to cook the goose. The same philosophy extends to the side characters, especially the ones who should feel like walking lore dumps, but don't. Take Lionel Baratheon, the man hosting the Ashford Tournament. He's everything this show supposedly rejects. A great house lord, a Baratheon, a name that echoes through Westerosi history. In another series, he'd be framed like a demigod. Slow motion entrances, ominous music, a speech about legacy and blood. Instead, Lionel is just present, loud, charismatic, physically imposing, and instantly magnetic. He commands attention not because the script tells you he's important, but because he is. He feels like a man who enjoys life and enjoys people. He enjoys spectacle, and that makes him unpredictable in a way no prophecy ever could. What's crucial is that Lionel doesn't exist to advance some grand myth. He isn't there to remind you about the future of House Baratheon or tease Robert's rebellion. He exists in the now. He's part of the living ecosystem of the world, not a signpost pointing to another show. And that contrast is everything. The series isn't allergic to powerful figures, it just refuses to mythologize them by default. Power here is human, messy, and performative, not divine. And this brings us to the tone. If I had to describe the tone of this show in one word, it would be sincere. And in 2026, sincerity is a rare commodity in Hollywood. We live in an era of irony-poisoned blockbusters where every emotional moment has to be undercut by a quip because the writers are too afraid to let the audiences actually feel something. The show intentionally strips away the epicness. There's no 2-minute CGI intro with the gears of the world turning. The music isn't trying to blow your eardrums out with a ba-ba-ba-bum rhythm. It's a story about two people who just genuinely care about each other, navigating a world that doesn't care about them at all. By having a smaller budget and a shorter runtime, the showrunners were forced to focus on the characters. They couldn't hide a bad script behind a 40-minute drag and battle. So they actually had to, write? What a concept. Imagine if every studio did that. We might actually get good movies again. It's impossible to talk about any new show set in Westeros without the ghost of the great houses looming over the conversation. We live in the era of the cinematic universe, where every new product is constantly measured against its predecessors. It's like being the younger sibling in a family of overachievers. Except your older brothers eventually grew up, developed a drug habit, and burned the family house down for insurance money. But the fascinating thing about this show is that the more you compare it to the rest of the franchise, the more it starts to look like a completely different species. Let's start with the big blonde fire-breathing dragon in the room, House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon is what I call prestige misery. It is a grand, sweeping historical chronicle. It has a massive budget, the intricate Valyrian wigs that cost more than my car, and a cast of characters who spend 90% of their time standing in dark rooms looking depressed about their inheritance. It's a political drama with capital letters. Every conversation is about the realm, the succession, and the fate of the dynasty. And don't get me wrong, I like House of the Dragon, especially Season 1. When it's firing on all cylinders, it's some of the best political maneuvering on TV, but man, it can be exhausting. It's a 10-hour marathon of people being terrible to each other for the sake of a chair. It's a cold show. It's a show where you need a family tree and a PhD in Targaryen genealogy just to understand why two cousins are trying to murder each other. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is the complete opposite. It's an intimate one-on-one interaction. If House of the Dragon is a grand operatic tragedy, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a 30-minute indie film that accidentally wandered onto a blockbuster set. The format alone tells you everything. House of the Dragon sticks to that traditional prestige 60-minute runtime, which often leads to a lot of narrative bloat. Season 2 of House of the Dragon felt like it was stuck in a parking lot for half the season. We spent weeks in Harrenhal watching Daemon Targaryen have hallucinations like he'd taken too many mushrooms at a medieval rave. It was moving the chess pieces, but nobody actually made a move for about 8 episodes. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms uses a 30-minute, almost sitcom-ish structure, and I don't mean sitcom as an insult. I mean it's tight, lean, there's no fat on the bone here, it's just all meat. But the real downfall comparison happens when we look at the later seasons of Game of Thrones. This is where A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms feels like a direct apology for the sins of Benioff and Weiss. The biggest crime of late Game of Thrones was the destruction of internal logic. We talked about fast travel and teleportation, we talked about characters surviving impossible odds because they had plot armor thicker than a dragon's hide. The show became an action fantasy where logic was sacrificed at the altar of the big moment. It was junk food cinema on a $200 million scale. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a real-time adventure. If Dunk gets punched in the face, he has a bruise for the next 2 episodes. If he makes a mistake, he pays for it immediately. There are no fantasy high fives or cool dragon flight sequences to distract you from the writing. Now, outside of the Westeros bubble, there is the first movie that pops in mind at first when you think about this show, and that is the 2001 film A Knight's Tale. You've got the low-born guy pretending to be a knight, the tournament focus, the buddy dynamic, and the general spirit of adventure. It's a Heath Ledger vibe. Also, Mark Addy, who played Robert Baratheon, is actually in that movie. Now you can sleep at night with that useless bit of information. But there's one key difference. A Knight's Tale is a Hollywood adventure. It's fun, it's pop rock, and everyone is generally having a great time. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is A Knight's Tale, but sadder. It has the adventurous spirit, but it's drenched in the grime and blood of George R.R. Martin's world. And it kind of reminds me of something like Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, where Dunk fights. It's not a stylish movie fight, it's dirty, clumsy, and violent. You feel the weight of the armor, you hear the desperate breathing inside the helmet, you see the mud getting into the wounds. It's not aesthetic, it's unpleasant. There's also a heavy Mandalorian Season 1 influence here. The lone wolf and cub trope, a man of few words, defined by a code he struggles to live up to, traveling with a special child who sees the world differently. It's a classic buddy duo dynamic, but unlike the later seasons of The Mandalorian, which became a cameo simulator for Star Wars nerds, thanks for that Disney, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms stays focused on its leads. It doesn't need a CGI Luke Skywalker to show up to save the day. When I watch House of the Dragon, I'm watching a historical chronicle. I know where it leads. I know the Targaryens eventually fall. I know the dragons die out. It's all a bit predetermined. But when I watch Dunk and Egg, it feels like anything can happen, because the stakes are so small, they feel more dangerous. If he gets arrested, there's no dragon coming to break him out of jail. He's just a guy. And because he's just a guy, his goodness feels like a superpower. In a world as dark and cynical as Westeros, choosing to be kind is the most action-packed thing you can do. This show is the anti-Season 8. It's the anti-junk food. It's a slow burn that actually has something to say. It reminds us that Game of Thrones was never supposed to be about the throne, it was about the game. It was about the people playing it and the people who get crushed by the board. By comparing it to the epic disasters of the past, we see exactly why Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is so successful. It's successful because it has the restraint that the rest of the franchise lost. It's not trying to be the biggest thing on TV. It's just trying to be a good story. And in the modern landscape of content factory slop, being a good story is the rarest thing of all. And what about the men behind the scenes? We live in the era of the executive meddling apocalypse. It's a time where studios treat creative properties like cows meant to be milked until they're produced nothing but dust and disappointment. Usually, this process involves a boardroom of suits who have never read the source material, hiring hot new writers who think they can improve upon the creator's vision by adding modern sensibilities or, God forbid, more mystery boxes. We've seen it time and time again. We saw it when Game of Thrones ran out of books and Benioff and Weiss decided that internal logic was for nerds and that what people really wanted was shocks for the sake of shocks. We've seen it in the Disneyfication of Star Wars, where the story is frequently sacrificed so that a CGI character from 40 years ago can walk on screen and make the audience go, "Hey, I remember that. 10 out of 10. Masterpiece." It's nostalgia baiting. It's the death of art by 1,000 corporate cuts. This is why the relationship between George R.R. Martin and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is so fascinating. It feels like the creator isn't just a consultant whose notes got thrown into the trash the second he leaves the room. He is the North Star. Martin has been vocally, almost aggressively enthusiastic about this show, and if you've been following his blog lately, which is essentially a masterclass in polite shade, you would know that he hasn't been nearly as happy with the direction of House of the Dragon, and more specifically the showrunner Ryan Condal. There have been reports of his notes being ignored, of butterfly effects caused by cutting key characters, and a general sense that the showrunners there are starting to wander off the path that he built. But Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, this is the A student of adaptations. It treats the source with a level of fidelity that borders on the religious. The creative team led by Ira Parker has clearly decided that the best way to write a George R.R. Martin story is to, use the words George R.R. Martin wrote. Like, what a revolutionary concept. A massive amount of the dialogue is closely adapted from the novellas, often line for line in spirit. You can feel that literary density. It doesn't sound like usual TV writing, it sounds like a world that has been lived in. But it goes beyond just copying and pasting text. The show successfully adapts the internal world of Ser Duncan. In the books, Dunk is a very internal character. We spend a lot of time in his head, hearing his doubts, his clumsy honesty, and his constant reminders to himself that he is Dunk the Lunk, thick as a castle wall. Converting that into a visual medium is hard. Usually, a lazy director would just use a voiceover, the ultimate tell don't show sin, but Knight of the Seven Kingdoms trusts its lead actor to convey that inner life through nuance. When Dunk stares at a bowl of stew, you aren't just seeing a guy being tall or hungry, you're seeing a man who is constantly out of place, wrestling with the weight of an identity he's not sure he deserves. It's a one-to-one scale adaptation of a character's soul, but the real gold here is the complete and total absence of franchise signaling. We are so used to being bopped over the head with fan service. In House of the Dragon, they can't go 5 minutes without showing us the Valyrian steel dagger or mentioning the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy. It's like the show is terrified that you'll forget it's related to Game of Thrones. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms doesn't care if you like its lore. It doesn't give you nostalgia bait. There are no heavy-handed ties to the main series. The connections are light strokes, tiny details that reward the book readers but don't alienate the casual viewer. There's no epic map rising out of the ground, no Ramin Djawadi theme to trigger your Pavlovian fantasy mode. Even the music is restrained, personal, and modest. Usually when a franchise gets this big, it becomes homework. If you want to watch the latest Marvel movie, you have to watch 3 Disney Plus shows, 4 previous movies, and read a comic from 1974. If you want to watch House of the Dragon, you need to have a working knowledge of the Targaryen succession laws and a family tree that looks like a bowl of spaghetti. But a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms requires zero homework. You don't need to know who the Mad King was. You don't need to know about the Long Night. You don't even need to know what a Westeros is. Because Dunk is a commoner, he is in the same position as a brand new viewer. He doesn't know the high politics. He doesn't know the high law. He's just a guy trying to survive a tournament. This makes the show a perfect entry point. It's Westeros without the baggage. It's a human story about human relationships, and that is a universal language. This creative confidence is what sets the show apart. It treats its simplicity not as a budgetary deficit, but as an artistic choice. The shorter runtime and smaller scale aren't there because HBO was being cheap. They're there because that's what the story needs. It avoids the narrative water and the filler that has started to plague every other prestige show. And the best part? There's a roadmap. Martin has plans for 12 additional stories about Dunk and Egg. Unlike the original Game of Thrones, which ran out of source material and started winging it with disastrous results, the creators here have a GPS. They know where the road leads. So, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms works because it's a small story that isn't afraid to stay small. We started this journey in the mud, staring at a hedge knight with a stomach bug, and we've ended up realizing that this humble, low-budget show might be the most important thing to happen to Westeros in a decade. It's a bit of a plot twist, isn't it? But because I have seen too many franchises fall apart, I have to offer a cautious outlook. I've seen masterpieces turn into disasters the second the studio decides that more is better. The biggest risk is the book problem. Yes, George R.R. Martin has provided a roadmap for 12 stories, but as we know, George's roadmaps sometimes lead to a cliff where the bridge hasn't been built yet. For the love of God, finish the Winds of Winter. There is a very real danger that this show will eventually outrun the author, and we all know how that ended last time. I don't want to see a season 5 where Dunk suddenly starts knowing a killer when he sees one. There's also the risk of scope creep. Right now, the show's charm is its intimacy, but what happens when the budget goes up? What happens when the studio executives decide that Dunk needs to be involved in a global conflict, or, God forbid, ride a dragon to save the world? The second this show tries to be epic, it loses the very thing that makes it special. Simplicity is its superpower, but in Hollywood, simplicity is often treated as a deficit that needs to be fixed, with more explosions and CGI lizards. And of course, don't forget the industry. The plan to have the actors age in real time over 10 years sounds poetic, but this is HBO we're talking about. In a world of content factory schedules and corporate mergers, keeping a small low-stakes show alive for a decade is a massive logistical gamble. I worry that they'll try to speed it up or Marvelify it into a series of interconnected spin-offs that eventually choke the life out of the story. However, if they can resist those urges, then A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms could be the blueprint for the future of the franchise. It's a perfect companion to the epic scale of House of the Dragon. It proves that you can have multiple shows in the same universe that feel completely different. You can have the grand opera and you can have the acoustic set. And right now, I'm finding that acoustic set is the one that I actually want to listen to. It's a verification of a new model. We don't need a $100 million Aegon's Conquest movie, even though that would be kind of cool, or a Jon Snow sequel where he just mopes around the wall for 10 hours. We need small stories. We need character-driven, experimental spin-offs that explore the corners of the world instead of the center of the throne. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms works because it understands that Westeros is a living environment, not just a stage. It works because it treats its audience with respect. And it works because it remembers that at the end of the day, a knight is just a man with noble intentions, and a squire is just a kid with a secret, and the mud under their feet is more real than any prophecy. So, I'm going to stay cautiously optimistic. I'm going to enjoy the goose eggs and the bickering and the clumsy honesty while it lasts. Anyway, that is it for me today. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive. If you enjoyed this therapeutic venting about the state of Westeros, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And remember, if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by prophecies, lore-heavy politics, or the inevitable decay of your favorite franchise, just find a muddy field, buy some goose eggs, and try not to hit your head on the doorframe. It worked for Dunk, and honestly, it's probably better than anything Season 8 has given us. Take care of yourself, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.